Today is Sunday, January 30th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I'm out today for my daily walk in a beautiful, crisp, clear and cold January afternoon. Today, while I'm out for this walk, I'd like to make a case for why I believe that homeschooling is the best option for Christian students in 2022. Why homeschooling is the best option for Christian kids in 2022. And when I say best option, I mean homeschooling offers Christian children elite educational opportunities, elite cultural opportunities in 2022. And private schools, public schools can't compete. Now, I'm not saying this as someone who's biased. I'm not saying this as someone who's a hater and, just tries to badmouth and bash schools. I didn't say that schools are bad. I said homeschooling is the best. If I wanted to work in a private school, teaching or even in administration, I could have a job within a couple weeks. But I choose to devote myself to homeschooling because as technology continues to develop, I believe that the gap between homeschooling and schooling is just going to continue to widen, and there's really going to be no comparison. However, I'm going to qualify all of this talk and say this is only true for families that know what they're doing. Most of what's done in the name of homeschooling is irrational, is self-defeating, and just makes no sense whatsoever. The opportunities that are available for homeschool students in 2022 are amazing, but parents have to learn how to homeschool in order to take advantage of these opportunities and give their children an elite education. There are lots of obstacles that prevent parents from doing this, and I'd like to talk about what parents need to do to give their children an elite education growing up while homeschooling. And I'd like to also make the case for why homeschooling is the best option for Christian parents and why that gulf is going to increase over time between what's possible in homeschooling and what's possible in a brick and mortar school. I'd also like to share some personal information about my own children's education and what we do as a homeschooling family to illustrate the kinds of opportunities that I'm talking about. Now, there's a stereotype for homeschool children. It's sort of a joke in school circles, in academic circles. If your kids are teenagers, they're probably aware of these stereotypes. And while they may not like them, they likely fulfill them and prove them to be true. The stereotype of the homeschool student is a boy or a girl, but even worse, a boy who's kept home and educated by his mother, who believes that the way to raise a Christian man is by preventing him from ever doing anything bad seeing anything bad, hearing anything bad, experiencing anything bad, that if you can just keep your baby free from corruption, he'll turn out to be a saint or a good Christian man. That's the idea in the minds of most homeschooling parents. They'd like to keep their children away from the bad kids, away from all of the dangerous teachers in the schools, away from all of the institutions that are trying to convert them into communists or fundamentalists, depending on what your political side of the fight might be. And so we need to shelter the kids, keep them away from the world, don't let anybody defile them or influence them for bad. And if we do this, then we'll have a saint in our children as they reach adulthood. And of course, this doesn't work. It's actually an idea and an approach to education that's rooted in false teaching. And that culture of retreating, hiding, avoiding, limiting, etc., is the stereotypical homeschool culture. And most homeschool families fulfill the stereotype. Now, if it actually worked, if this idea of withdrawing, hiding, sheltering, limiting, restricting, preventing, and so on, if this method actually did produce saintly young men and women, I would be all for it. I would say, who cares what the world thinks? Who cares if we're mocked or scoffed at? If the end result is that we produce saints, we don't care what the world says. But that's not the end result. That's not the end result of that approach to education. It doesn't produce saints. And most of the saints that you'll point to as the most famous and influential of the saints weren't raised like that. And this is the disconnect in the minds of homeschooling parents. They talk about saints, but they don't actually imitate saints. They don't follow the advice of saints. They talk about wise men of the past, but they don't do what those wise men actually teach. Recently I posted an article on the Academy website titled Quintilian on Homeschooling. And I strongly recommend, if you're a homeschooling parent, I strongly recommend that you make time to read the opening chapters of Quintilian's book on the education of an orator. It's a 1st century Roman book on education. It's available in English translation. I'm not telling you to read the whole thing. I'm talking about the introductory chapters, because Quintilian discusses the issues involved in choosing the best education for a child. And he talks about the pros and cons of sending a boy to school as opposed to keeping a boy at home and hiring a private tutor. Because this was the dilemma that parents faced in ancient Rome. or in the first century. Quintilian makes the argument that it's better to send a boy to a school. And of course, when he says that, he's talking about the schools that were available in his generation. He's not necessarily talking about the schools available in our generation. He's assuming that if you send a boy to school in first century Rome, he's going to be taught the classical liberal arts. He's going to be taught classical moral philosophy. And there's a lot more in the culture than just that. For example, men had servants, and one of the servants that a man might have was called a pedagogue. And a pedagogue was simply an adult companion for a child. So if the child was sent to school, he'd be accompanied by an adult servant who would make sure that he behaved well. So there's a lot more to first century culture than just what book are you studying, or what curriculum are you studying, or whether or not you go to school. There's also a difference in what going to school meant in the first century and how family life was organized, because I'll make the case that it was much better than it is today. But we can replicate a lot of the benefits that were available in the first century, not by imitating our generation, which is what most Christians do, and why Christianity is in such a mess, but by looking back to how wise men lived, especially wise heads of households, men who had servants. All they needed to do was figure out what to do, and they had the manpower to do it. In our generation, because we don't have servants, and because Christian men are lazy, we haven't considered how the benefits of the first century culture might be replicated in our generation, even if we don't have a servant culture like they did. We can't choose to have the benefits or not have the benefits. We have to have the benefits. The question is simply how we're to procure them when a slave society no longer exists, when households don't run and can't take servant work for granted. But Quintilian talked about the benefits of schooling, and I agree with him on all the benefits. I think he makes a very clear case, a case that I would completely agree with, that the benefits of sending a boy to a classical liberal arts school with good teachers and respectable classmates offers benefits that are not available at home with a private tutor. And Quintilian explains what these benefits are, and some of them are profound, and they're the kinds of things that experienced teachers and maybe experienced parents would understand, but inexperienced parents, young homeschooling parents with young children simply won't understand. It seems among young homeschooling parents that they tend to think no one has ever tried what they're about to try before, or that they're smarter and better than anyone else who has ever done it, and the results of other people's works are not going to have any bearing on what they do, even though they repeat all of the same exact things. But Quintilian explains that there are simply benefits of schooling that aren't available at home with a private tutor. And in the first century, when he said those things, he was right. In fact, he was right through the 20th century. But in 2022, I would argue that he's no longer right. That the benefits that were available in the first century school are today actually available at home and not at school. Our schools today are inferior to the schools that he took for granted, and our at-home resources are superior to what he took for granted in the first century. I would argue that the situation has actually flipped, that the advantages today are at home and the disadvantages at school. First of all, because modern schools don't teach the classical liberal arts. They don't teach classical moral philosophy. Second of all, because the way the schools are structured, the kinds of people who are hired to be teachers, the grade level system, you're not sending your kid to a classical school with an expert schoolmaster and a proven classical curriculum. Ideas in our generation about children and the rights of children and how children can behave and all of these things also surround our children with friends and classmates with bad morals, and those morals aren't checked. Good morals are not taught and enforced. And so the benefits that Quintilian describes about first century schools are simply not true of 21st century schools. So it's flipped. Now the problem is that, like I said, most parents who choose to homeschool have this cowardly, retreating, turtle in its shell mentality that's based on the error of Pelagianism or semi-Pelagianism. And I've talked about this in past talks. If you think that your child is born good and is made bad by outside influences, you do not believe what the Catholic Church teaches about human nature. If you believe that your child is born into the world an innocent, pure soul, and that if you keep him pure, if you keep him innocent, he will go on in his original innocence, you are not holding the Catholic teaching about human nature. You're basing your parenting ideas on a heretical idea that taught that the corruption of Adam's sin was not passed on through natural reproduction. That only the guilt of original sin was passed on, but the actual corruption was not passed on. That man is actually born guilty, but innocent. In the 1700s, a non-Catholic philosopher named John Locke taught that man is born as a blank tablet, a blank sheet of paper. He's empty. He doesn't have anything bad in him. He's just empty. And what outside sources put into him makes him what he is. And of course, this is false teaching. Our children are born corrupt. They are born under a curse of condemnation. They are both guilty of sin and they are corrupted by sin at birth. The sacrament of baptism is given to children because they're bad, because they're sinful, because they're evil. That's why they're baptized at birth. Baptism does a couple of things. I recommend you take some time and study what the Catechism teaches about the effects of baptism. You'll see that the Church does not believe that we're receiving these pure, innocent little angels, but we're receiving fallen, corrupt, condemned descendants of Adam and Eve. Baptism cleanses a child of the guilt of original sin. And baptism imparts to the child grace to help him in his life's battle against sin. But the Church teaches that the inclination to sin, which is called concupiscence, remains in the child after baptism. He is inclined to sin. He is evil. And the only way that that child can become a saint and live in heaven with God for eternity is if he, by his own free will, chooses to cooperate with the grace that's given to him, with the means of grace that are made available to him, if he labors to save his soul, according to the gospel, he can be saved. That's why when St. Thomas Aquinas was asked, "What must I do to be a saint?" his answer was, "You must will it." Baptism does not make a child a saint. Baptism does not somehow celebrate the innocence and purity of a child. Baptism washes away the guilt of original sin and gives the child help as he enters into the world. But that child, as he grows, must make conscious, deliberate choices to cling to what is good and resist what is evil. In the past, and you'll find this in the writing of Quintilian, the personality of the child was recognized as being so influential on the child's life that they believed that the environment had less to do with a child's adult life than the child's personality, the child's natural dispositions. Quintilian would argue that you could take a child with a good disposition and surround him with inferior classmates or peers, and he will seek what's good, and he will influence others for good. And you can take another child with a bad disposition, and you can surround him with good influences, and he will seek out what is bad even there. And that disposition has more to do with that child's life and choices and behavior than the outside influences in the child's life. And we can see this all through history. We can see that individuals choose their own way in spite of the external circumstances and influences around them. We can watch throughout sacred scripture as a devout father raises one good son and one bad son. We can watch as Jesus Christ himself cannot take Judas out of the path of destruction. And yet there are other disciples who torture cannot take them out of the good path. The disposition of the individual, the will of the individual, has far more influence in his life's choices and outcomes than his external circumstances. And of course, we're not going to some stupid opposite extreme and saying you can plunge a good child into hell itself and he won't be influenced by it. That's presumption. We're never to enter into occasions of sin knowingly or intentionally. But just because there is potential for evil doesn't mean that a certain environment or situation is an occasion of sin. There is potential evil in every set of circumstances. When we talk about avoiding occasions of sin, what we mean is that if you know that you're going to be tempted to sin against God in this situation, and you willingly enter into that temptation, you've already made the choice. You're not trying to resist temptation. You're not praying, "Lead me not into temptation." You are actually entering into temptation voluntarily. And you're already sinning. But that's not the same thing as entering into a situation where there could be sin, but not necessarily. Where there might be temptation, but not necessarily. Or where the desired end or the potential good outweighs the potential harm. That would be true in any just war, for example. And so when we raise children, our desired outcome is not that we keep them as this little blank tablet, as this little bucket of pure water, that we keep them from being tainted by any outside influences, because that's impossible within a responsible life. We have to be careful that our fear of a bad influence is so inordinate or out of balance that we paralyze Christian people and don't allow them to actually carry out the work that they're supposed to do. St. Paul, for example, was an apostle who was a missionary. He entered into pagan cities that were filled with pagan stuff. And we can be sure that he had to see and hear all kinds of evil. But he was there to preach the gospel. And Jesus told his disciples to go into a city, preach the gospel to that place, and if they reject it, to leave it. But if they receive it, to stay there and teach. Teach them to observe all that he commanded, to initiate them into the Christian community, to found a church there. And that's what the apostles did. But they had to spend their time in places that were not practicing the Christian faith. That's not what it means to enter into an occasion of sin. Entering into an occasion of sin would have meant that St. Paul chose to go and hang out in some immoral bar on a Friday night because he wanted to hang out in an immoral bar. And then, when he was tempted to some sin, he says, well, I didn't mean to do it. No, you chose to enter into the occasion of sin. You didn't go there to evangelize people. There's no reason why you had to be in the bar. Those same people are available in the marketplace all day long. There's no reason you had to go talk to them at midnight on Friday in the bar. That's the difference between an occasion of sin and simple interaction with the world. Our children are going to be inclined to evil always. And if we try to prevent them from ever doing anything bad, from ever seeing anything bad, hearing anything, they're not going to be able to live a responsible Christian life. They have to learn to resist temptation and to overcome evil with good. If parents overreact to every evil, if parents overreact and just ignore the gospel and ignore the actual teaching about the Christian way of life, and they blow everything out of proportion and pretend that every single act that isn't extraordinarily saintly and holy is a mortal sin, then they're going to cripple their child. And those parents are likely crippled themselves with scrupulosity. And I would argue that this shelter approach to homeschooling, this turtle in the shell approach, is actually the result of scrupulosity in the parents. The reason why I say all of this is because as Christians, we have to get out of that bondage of overreaction, of scrupulosity, of living in constant fear and timidity, afraid of things, neglecting our actual responsibility, which as lay people is to influence temporal affairs, not to surrender every institution and retreat from all temporal affairs because there's bad guys out there. Our job is to engage and influence temporal affairs for good. And people who do that, people who actually do that, are not afraid of the boogeyman outside. In fact, the proverb says, "The wicked flee when no one pursues them." Their fears are imaginary. They think that somebody's out to get them. They live in this world of conspiracy theories with this dark cloud always following them around. They think that that darkness They think that that sense of dread is actually coming from other people when it's their own conscience putting them in a state of fear. The wicked flee. The wicked run away and hide when no one is pursuing them. And again, what they're fleeing from is not bad people out there. They're fleeing from this haunting shadow of their own guilty conscience. And one of the reasons they may have a guilty conscience is because they know that they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing in their lives. What we see in the lives of many Christian people, for all their talk about saints and holiness and all these virtuous things they talk about, we see a life that resembles the life of the wicked. A life of timidity, a life of cowardice and fear, of retreating and surrendering, a life that prefers to hide and be left alone. This isn't how truly righteous people live. This isn't how truly virtuous people live. That same proverb says, the wicked flees when no one pursues him, but the righteous is bold like a lion. The righteous is bold like a lion. The righteous doesn't live with a sense of fear around every corner. People often ask me if I have a gun to protect my home, and I tell them, no, I don't have a gun. I don't know why anyone would live with a sense of fear that would lead them to think that they have to get a gun and keep it in the house because some bad guy is going to break into their house. If you're living with that kind of irrational fear, like a child afraid of the dark, rather than thinking you need to stockpile arms to protect yourself from these imaginary bad guys, you need to ask whether there's not another cause of this fear that haunts your life. Maybe you're afraid of your house being broken into because you know you're storing up treasure on earth like Jesus said not to, and now you're careful about it and you're worried that someone's going to try to steal it. If that's the case, a gun isn't the solution. If you have a sense that God is not with you and that you're subject to all kinds of evil, a gun is not going to help you. That's the irrationality that comes with fear. I don't have a gun because I would never even think of someone breaking into my house. And if someone did break into my house, I wouldn't panic and start shooting a gun at them. And if you don't believe me, this is part of this mentality of fear. You can't comprehend that another person doesn't live with that fear, as if they're lying. No. You shouldn't be living with that fear, thinking of other people like they're just all a bunch of criminals and bandits out to get your stuff and attack you. It's not true. It's the same way a child thinks about the boogeyman in the dark. Same exact problem. And many Christians live in the world just like children who are afraid of the dark. Afraid. Oh, if we homeschool, social services might show up. The state might take our kids away. The state's not interested in taking anybody's kids. Unless you're actually abusing them, maybe you should worry about whether or not you're afraid of the state because you're actually breaking the law. Maybe that's why you're afraid. Not because the state is bad, but because your conscience is telling you that you are doing the kind of things that deserves punishment. And the solution is to fix the problem. Not lock the doors, not stockpile survival supplies, or load up on guns so that you can fight off the state when they should. Where does this craziness come from? St. Paul didn't live in fear of the world. None of the saints did. When St. Francis met a stranger, he didn't grab a hold of his money bag and clench his fist ready to fight. He lived with a good conscience. He lived with the freedom of the children of God, which Scripture talks about. And Christian parents have to live a Christian life, or they're not going to be able to educate their children. So, what I'm going to say is intended for parents who have already overcome these faults and are free to actually think soberly and realistically about the education of their children. Our job as parents is not to prevent our children from ever sinning. Sin is inevitable. Sin is natural. Sin is normal. And the solution to sin is not stricter and stricter prevention. The solution to sin is experience and increasing in grace, forgiveness, repentance, on and on and on through life, growing and being sanctified. We don't live a holy life by never sinning. St. John explicitly targeted this false thinking in his epistles. Read the epistles of St. John. If anyone says he does not have sin, he's a liar. The Protestants have taught us that it's cool to say that you used to sin in your old life. But Protestants don't like to admit that they continue sinning. And that's why they don't like Catholicism, because they don't like the idea of confessing their present sins. What's humiliating is to confess yesterday's sins. That's what's humiliating. It's not humiliating for me to confess sins I committed when I was a 12-year-old kid. That's not humiliating. That's very easy. I can very easily talk about all the sinful things I did when I was a stupid kid. But a Christian has to confess the sinful things that he did this morning and last night and yesterday. And he has to confess his continued sin. He has to acknowledge his continued weakness, which goes with him to the grave. Because that's part of the confession of the gospel. We confess like Jesus did and say, no one is good but God. I am a weak, sinful creature that is capable of being saved by the mercy of God through the resurrection. I'm not saved because after I learned about Jesus, I stopped sinning forever. That's not the gospel. That's a lie. Our children are going to sin and sin and sin. Dealing with the sin is the work of parenting. Jesus said, "Whoever is forgiven much loves much." Whoever is forgiven much loves much. When St. Peter asked Jesus, "How many times should I forgive my brother?" Jesus said, 70 times 7 times. In other words, you're going to be forgiving your brother constantly throughout your life, because you're never going to stop sinning. Sure, you'll have victory over certain sins, and your life will, if you're collaborating with God's grace, your life will get more and more sanctified, but you will still sin throughout your life. And just because your sins are of a different kind doesn't mean they're less culpable, because when you sin as an experienced Christian, you're sinning with more knowledge, with more experience. And so even small sins as an older Christian are no less significant than the sins of your youth. In fact, they can be even more significant. But the sin of our life is just a natural reality. We're going to sin until we die, when we will finally stop sinning. Christ has provided the sacrament of reconciliation because his disciples are going to sin for their entire lives. If you ask your priest, "How often should I go to confession?" he doesn't look at you confused and say, "When should you go to confession?" Never. Stop sinning. No priest will say that, because that's not the Christian way. Your priest will say something like, "Go to confession once a month. Go to confession every 2 weeks. Go to confession as often as possible." Every time you receive communion at Mass, your venial sins are washed away. It's constantly assumed in the Catholic life that sin is present, that you are continuing to sin. And so this fake life where we pretend we don't sin, and what we mean by sin is simply avoiding sins that other people see that will embarrass us, is not the Christian life. What most parents are afraid of is that their children will do something bad and other Catholic adults will find out about it, and the parents will be embarrassed in front of other. And that's because your community of Catholics doesn't understand the Christian life. You're like a bunch of actors pretending that you're something you're not, and when one of the kids goes out of character, doesn't play his part, but actually reveals what's going on underneath the costume, the parents act horrified. And what they would like is if everyone just keeps acting. Keep your makeup on, keep your costume on, keep acting, stick to the script. That's not the Christian life. And many parents, what they're basically doing in their homeschool life is creating a stage. They're creating a play They're treating their kids like actors and actresses in a play. They're even playing the role of the director and an actor or actress in this play. And that's what they call the Christian life, or family life, or homeschooling. It's an act, like a stage production. And everyone has to stay in character. That's not the Christian life. So moving beyond that, and if you can't move beyond that, there's no hope, because you're stuck. You're stuck in a pit that's limiting what you can do, and it's making homeschooling to be unproductive, maybe even counterproductive. And it doesn't work. As I said earlier, it doesn't work. We see these families and these kids crash and burn all the time. And everyone just continues repeating the same failed approach to not just homeschooling, but the Christian life in general. We have to come out of that. We have to live the true Christian life. We have to grow in grace. We have to imitate Christ's incarnation. We don't need to stay in heaven to be holy. We need to come into the world. And what Christ showed us is that we can live a holy life in the world by the grace of God. That's the way that we become holy, by living in the world but not being of the world. You have to resist the temptation, not hide from it. Mother Angelica famously said with her humor that it would be easy to be a saint if it weren't for other people. That's the mentality that many homeschool families live with. Even though they laugh at what she says as if they think it's true, they practice exactly the fault that she's making fun of in the saying. Everybody would be a saint if they didn't do the actual work of the Christian life. Everybody could act like a saint, that is. They could act and pretend. But what happens when they actually enter into the real arena of the Christian life is they break down. And that's what they're afraid of. Like the saying, if you can't handle the heat, stay out of the kitchen. Real life in the world is that kitchen. It's where we have to actually practice the Christian life. It's very difficult. It's humiliating. We fail repeatedly, and we have to continue fighting. We have to pray. We have to fast. We have to overcome our weaknesses. We have to confess our sins and do penance. And we have to fight and study and pray to overcome our sins, to break away from our vices and establish virtuous habits. That's the work of the Christian life. And we have to do all that in the presence of unbelievers. One of the Psalms that we read at evening prayer, God says to the king, rule in the midst of your enemies. Rule not in hiding from your enemies, not rule after I've removed all of your enemies. That's not what it means to rule. Rule in the midst of your enemies. We have to embrace this real Christian life. And we have to understand that our children have to learn to live this real Christian life, and hiding from it, avoiding failure, is not the right path. What's available to a Christian kid today in homeschooling? First of all, he can study the classical liberal arts at home with no restrictions. He can study the classical liberal arts right from the comfort of his own kitchen table. It's an opportunity that has never existed, but it exists today for Christian kids. And we'll see if they make use of the opportunity or if they just waste it. There are resources available to help Christian kids satisfy modern requirements that can easily be addressed. I've said this in other talks. I recommend that homeschool kids use a program like Khan Academy just to work through the basic content of modern math, science, and English requirements. There's Khan Academy, there's IXL. Just familiarize oneself with the content and the concepts of the modern curriculum. It doesn't have to be the kid's curriculum. It doesn't have to take over the kid's life. It shouldn't be the only thing the kid does. It's not sufficient to be used exclusively. The modern curriculum is not sufficient for Christian education. But to become familiar with all the concepts, to be introduced to the concepts, is important because the compulsory education requirements are real. And we should seek to satisfy and exceed them. A program like Khan Academy, a program like IXL, allows kids to do that from kindergarten all the way up through high school. Khan Academy is free. IXL, I believe, there's a fee for. My kids use Khan Academy. It gives them something positive to do, something that addresses compulsory requirements. It's the same program that's being used in public schools. They're being exposed to all of the concepts that our generation is requiring of kids in modern schools. It's good for them to do that. But if they are introduced to those things, it's not going to take long for them to realize that those standards are low. It's not going to take long for them to realize that Khan Academy actually isn't very good. And that's a good place for them to be, because then they will clearly see the superiority of the studies that are available in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. They'll clearly see how much more rigorous the assessments and assignments are in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. They'll objectively and experientially see that the Christian education is a different level than the secular education. And they'll see that. Quintilian said that kids like to be in classes with other kids because they like to imitate their peers, and then once they are capable of imitating their peers, then they like to exceed their peers. But that imitation of your peers is a natural first step. And when kids get their footing and they see that I can do what my peers do, that's when they look ahead to see what they can do that their peers can't do. And they try to outdo each other. You'll see kids do this on the playground. It'll always, at first it will be who can play the game. But then as soon as the kids realize that they can play the game, it'll be who can kick the ball the farthest, who can throw the ball the fastest, who can run the fastest, who can jump the highest. But it will start with simple imitation. Khan Academy allows for simple peer imitation. And once the kids realize they can do that, and it's not challenging, and there's more gas left in their tank, that's when they'll start to look at what they can do to exceed their peers. And that's where they'll see that what the Classical Liberal Arts Academy offers is not just different. It's not just different, and Khan Academy's cool, Classical Liberal Arts Academy's boring. Kids say anything's boring that's difficult, to pretend like they're not struggling. But once they get a taste of Khan Academy and get used to it, they're going to realize how low the standard is. And when they're comfortable at their grade level, then they're going to look to exceed their grade level. That's why Classical Liberal Arts Academy studies and something like Khan Academy will go hand in hand. That takes care of their academic work. They don't need anything else. There's no other study programs or resources needed. That's all that they need. If they have access to Khan Academy and the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, which for a normal student would cost a total of $25 a month for their homeschooling curriculum, they would have everything that they need. You don't need to buy stuff for the modern curriculum standards because Khan Academy covers everything, and you want the kid to not spend more time and attention on that stuff. You want them to see it, reach their grade level, and then exceed it. You don't want to buy grade level study materials. It makes no sense in 2022. This is the kind of stupid things that homeschool parents are doing. Classical Liberal Arts Academy, for their actual intellectual formation over time, the most rigorous course of studies available. And Khan Academy to help them reach grade level and then look to exceed grade level. What really matters is what the kids do outside of their academic work. Because there's only so much that they can do academically every day. They're only so strong mentally. You can't spend 20 hours a day on schoolwork. Parents that just want to hunker down in the house and pretend that they're just going to study endless hours end up not studying at all because it's just not possible. Our kids in our family, and this is why I said I want to talk a little bit about what my wife and I do with our kids. Our kids work on Khan Academy. Our kids work on Classical Liberal Arts Academy studies. And they do so from around 9 o'clock in the morning until around 5 p.m. They get some recess time. We have dinner. And then in the evening, they have opportunities to do things. Jiu-jitsu classes, dance classes, go to the local gym and exercise. They have opportunities to do things outside of academic work, strengthen their bodies, become agile, learn culture, develop skills, things that are useful, things, again, that allow them to know that they have equaled their peers and that allow them to exceed their peers. That's where confidence comes from. This awkward, clumsy, dopey homeschool kid is not given the opportunity to match and exceed his peers. And he lives with this awkward, clumsy sense and awareness of the reality that he is inferior to his peers in 1,000 different things. And parents can say, who cares? Your kid cares. That's who cares. Your children care. Ask them. Ask them if they care. They do care. And they should care. And you should care. They don't want to be inferior to their peers. They shouldn't want to be inferior to their peers. The Christian life isn't a matter of accepting the fact that you're inferior to your peers in a million different studies and pursuits and activities. That's not the Christian life. I strongly recommend martial arts classes where the school consciously teaches morality, responsibility, justice, and so on. For example, if you look in jiu-jitsu classes, there's Gracie Academy or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, and you'll find that the Gracie School of Jiu-Jitsu has a whole curriculum of character training that's built into their martial arts training program. They train the kids physically, they train the kids emotionally, they train the kids' character, they reinforce the teachings of their parents, they reinforce responsibility, the need to study, the need to work. They teach character in and through the martial arts, which I recommend for boys. And the same thing is true while some girls may choose to study jiu-jitsu as well. And I know the Christian parents will throw up the red flags and say that's not appropriate. But what's the alternative? Nothing? What's the alternative? Making dinner? How many meals do you need a day? St. Benedict says 1. Is a girl going to spend her whole day making the one meal of the day? No, so you just introduce new problems. And all you do as a parent is say no, 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 no. But when you're challenged to actually provide the positive solution, you're silent. And that's what produces the awkward homeschool kid. Their whole life, their rule of life is just, I don't do that, I don't do that, I don't do that, I don't do that. And it's just a list of things that they don't do, as if adding up all of these negatives in the end leads to a positive. It doesn't. What's the positive? The fact that you're overreacting can be shown by the fact that you can't produce a positive. And you can just say, well, we just focus constantly on prayer and the sacramental life and prayer. Who advises that? Who advises trying to replace an entire life with religious activities, with sacramental activities? Who recommends that? If you read St. Francis de Sales on the Introduction to the Devout Life, does he recommend that? No. You, as a married man or woman, are a lay person. You are not some kind of monk or nun. You're a lay person. It's your duty to pray, and for that the Church provides Liturgy of the Hours. That doesn't take 12 hours a day. You can fulfill your duty to recite the offices and make your own private prayers within an hour, maybe hour and a half a day. And we're talking extreme level of daily devotional life. Well, there's 22 hours left. Let's say we're going to sleep 6 or 7. So there's 16 hours left. What are you going to do with those 16 hours? play in the kitchen all day long? That's not Christian culture. Did women do that in the 1400s? Yeah, they also killed and skinned rabbits. They had to also kill and clean their own chickens. That's what took so long. And they only did that when they didn't have servants to do it. That's not female culture. Especially if you're living in the middle of a 21st century suburb. So the question is, what will the girls do outside of their studies? And there are things like dance classes, martial arts classes for girls that teach self-defense and physical fitness and character development. If you think that a martial arts class teaches girls to go punch boys in the face, then you don't know what you're talking about. So there are lots of activities that homeschool kids can make use of that schools have no advantage of. Schools don't even offer. And this is, again, one of the major differences between life in 2022 and, let's say, 1992. When I was in school in 1992, you went to school for extracurricular activities. To play sports, if you wanted to play sports, you went to school. The sports teams were at school. That's not even true anymore. That's not even true in 2022. If a boy is interested in sports, there are as many competitive opportunities in recreational leagues, in AAU leagues, private leagues, that there's no need to send a kid to school for extracurricular activities. The popularity of the martial arts, dance, music, on and on, all of these things are available today through private instruction. There's no need for anyone to go to school for these things. And this is one of my arguments where modern schools really no longer have anything to offer. The culture, the extracurricular life, the social life, etc., in the past was a benefit of enrolling kids in a good private school. Today, that's not true anymore. Unless you're focused on one or two specific sports that really can only exist in school, like football. Football, you're going to need to go to a high school to play. Even though there are some homeschool football teams that play local schools. They have them here in the Charlotte area. But that's an extreme example of one sport. There's no reason why kids have to play one particular sport. But there's other things kids have to do. They have to be able to develop themselves as human beings, body and soul. You can't study 20 hours a day. I'm an extreme example of an intellectual who can study 16 plus hours a day. But I get tired. I go running every day. I go to the gym. I go for walks. Because I can't study and study and pray and study and pray and pray and study and study. My body needs attention. I need exercise. I need to do some physical work. I need to sweat. I need to breathe. I need to get my heart pumping, my blood pumping. I need to be physically healthy so that I can study more and be healthy and be strong. And our kids need that same balance in their lives. When parents ask me, what should my kids study? What should our schedule be? How much should we try to get done? What I tell them is no, that's not the right approach. Establish a balanced life. Establish a balanced daily schedule. Address all of these different needs, and then in the time that you have available for study, simply concentrate on getting as much done as possible in that time. Stay positive. Don't set artificial goals and then walk around miserable because you torment yourself with your own artificial goal. That's not how wise people live. Make a balanced schedule. If you have 8 hours a day for study or more, use those hours to get as much done as possible. And if you want a good conscience will come when you know that you've worked hard to get as much done as possible. That's the moral life. Not setting some artificial standard or allowing some program to tell you what the standard is and you just going along with it and pretending like you're actually fulfilling some real standard when you're not. It's just arbitrary, made-up rules for how many lessons you're going to get done in a year. There's no rule. The rule is as much as possible, God helping us. But if you establish a balanced life where the kids have grade level studies to do to allow them to imitate and match their peers and have a sense of accomplishment, and then a rigorous set of studies that allowed them to exceed their peers, which is what the Classical Liberal Arts Academy provides, and then opportunities away from academic work, away from prayer, to exercise their bodies, to learn physical skills, to grow in confidence, to learn and develop better character. That's what produces a full life and makes homeschooling rich and productive and happy for the children. You can add to that music as well. I just posted today about a great piano program that's available today. It's called Playground Sessions. If you're interested in giving your children piano lessons at home, the stuff that's available today is awesome, but you have to learn how to use it and be willing to make efforts and sacrifices to make things available to your children. You can't raise Christian kids with this negative Nancy spirit that just says no to everything and pretends that sitting on the couch with your hands folded is to be a good Christian. And to do anything, to attempt anything, because there's a danger that you might act badly for a moment, is to be avoided, is just craziness. That's not the Christian life. That's not human life. That's not education. There are many, many good things for homeschool parents to use. In fact, the point of this talk is that there are so many good things for Christian parents to use that modern schooling cannot compete with homeschooling. Can't compete. And that includes religion as well. Homeschooling kids can help at the parish as altar servers during the week. All of these different opportunities. But my recommendation is that parents learn to step out of their comfort zone a little bit. Make financial sacrifices. Before you buy yourself, as a parent, nice clothes or up the mortgage on the house so that you have a bigger, nicer house, or add a third car or whatever, consider how that money could be used to benefit your kids. These things aren't expensive. You can radically improve the culture and confidence and overall quality of life for your children by investing a couple $100 a month. And if you can and do make that improvement in your kids' lives, It actually gives you, as a head of a household, it gives you something to work for. You're working not for your mortgage, not for your insurance, not for your bank account, so you can boast about how much you have in your dopey savings account. But you can think about the quality of life and education that you're giving your children, and you can work for that as your goal. You're going to be dead. No one's going to care about how nice your lawn was, how much money you had in the bank, how comfortable your life was, how nice your clothes were. No one's going to care. You're going to die, and you're going to leave your children behind. Invest in your children, not in yourself. Invest in your children, not in the opinion of other people about your adult life. These things aren't expensive, and they radically improve the quality of your children's life. You want to make your homeschool happy? This is how you make it happy. My kids don't mind school time, study time, prayer time, because they have a balanced life. They see me working to sacrifice to make opportunities available for them, and they know that I'm doing that at my own expense, and they respect it and are thankful. And it takes away a million vices from their lives because they're not idle, they're not arrogant, they're constantly challenged, they're challenged to learn new skills, they're challenged to pursue new levels of skills. There's always someone bigger than them, stronger than them, better than them. Homeschool kids often don't have challenge from their peers, and they become arrogant. They imagine that they're good at things because they're better than their younger siblings. And it just creates a messed up mentality. Opportunities and resources are available to kids today that are amazing, but parents have to learn about them and make use of them. In 2022, if Christians can get this right, homeschooling provides Christian children with educational opportunities that have never been available in the history of the world. What most homeschool parents are doing doesn't make sense, doesn't take advantage of these opportunities, and we see the results in the stereotypical homeschool students. If we get this right, we can raise a great generation of Christian kids. And through these experiences, we'll help them to learn about the world. They'll meet all kinds of different people. They'll have a realistic view of the world. They won't live with this wicked, slavish fear, this conspiracy theorist fear of others. They'll be challenged to grow. They'll be confident because they know that they're learning to do things and they have the opportunity to do them in the presence of their peers. And this is how their human character gets developed. And then on top of all that, we add their Catholic catechesis, their classical liberal arts education, their sacramental life, and we're starting to get to the point where we're fulfilling the potential of homeschooling. And that should be our goal. There's no comparison with homeschooling in 2022 for Christian kids. But parents have to realize you can't study 20 hours a day. There's a lot more that's needed. And for many Christian parents, they may have to learn things that they're not comfortable with. But that's why what the church teaches about human nature is that we're not supposed to live in isolation. We need to live in society. Man is a social animal, and as St. Thomas Aquinas explains, living in society allows all of us to enjoy a higher quality of life. Living in society, giving and taking in society, allows all of us to live a higher quality of life. And parents need to learn to do that, especially Christian homeschool parents. They need to learn to take advantage of the people and the expertise and the resources and the opportunities that are available in their communities, not living with this sort of guilty spirit that assumes evil of everybody else, but that gives people the benefit of the doubt, that goes out into society, makes friends, barters and trades with people, and improves the quality of everyone's life. Not just yours, but also the other people, which should be in your interests. So, I'm going to cut off there. That's a long talk. I hope that's helpful. If you'd like to talk about specifics of this, I'm happy to do so. Get in touch. I hope that this challenges you, because we need to be challenged, because what Christians are doing is not sufficient at this point. We're wasting opportunities. We're wasting resources. We're not fulfilling the potential of Christian education. And Christian homeschool families can offer their children the best education the world has ever seen on a wide scale. But they have to be willing to overcome spiritual faults, false thinking, wrong sentiments, so that they can have the freedom to be able to participate in society and gain benefits for their children and give benefits to others to enrich our quality of life. I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.